Welcome, everyone. My name's Amy Christensen, and I'm working on climate change for Google.org. And my good friend Meng asked me to do the introduction to Jon Kabat-Zinn, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to do so. But I first wanted to thank Meng for organizing this event. It's such a special occasion, and I thought that Meng's title was especially appropriate given that he's known as Jolly Good Fellow here at Google. It best captures Jon's teachings. So just a little bit of background on his bio. Jon Kabat-Zinn is a scientist, writer, and meditation teacher engaged in bringing mindfulness into the mainstream of medicine and society. He's professor of medicine emeritus at University of Massachusetts Medical School, where he was founding executive director of the Center for Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare, and Society, as well as founder and former director of its world-renowned stress reduction clinic, which I don't know about you guys, but I could use a little bit of that now. Looking forward to this. He's the author of many books, including Full Catastrophe Living, Using the Wisdom of Your Body and Mind to Face Stress, Pain, and Illness, as well as Wherever You Go, There You Are, the book that introduced me to him. Dr. Kabat-Zinn's work has contributed to a growing movement of mindfulness into mainstream institutions in our society, including medicine, healthcare, schools, corporations, and perhaps even here at Google. Dr. Kabat-Zinn received his PhD in molecular biology from MIT in 1971, and his research focused on mind-body interactions with healing and various clinical applications of mindfulness meditation, training for people with chronic pain and stress-related disorders. We're hoping that his teachings will help all of us to not only optimize our mental output for Google, but also optimize our quality of life wherever we are. So welcome, Jon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you for that very sweet introduction, and it's wonderful for me to be here. I've never been here before, and it does feel like an interesting planet to be on. I'm just feeling my way. But I too want to express my gratitude to Meng for inviting me, and I understand that I'm part of a much larger scheme in his mind. How many of you heard Alan Wallace talk when he was here some time ago? Not that many. So we're covering a very broad spectrum because I'm sure a lot of people showed up for his talk. And then Paul Ekman is going to come in May, I'm told. And Paul Ekman is also involved in this kind of work in another way, some of which I'll explain to you when I get to the slides. What's that? And Mathieu Ricard, whose face you'll see in some of the photographs I'll be showing, is coming next week. And I highly recommend to you to see him. We have sort of a parallel background in that I was a student of Salvador Luria's at MIT, who won the Nobel Prize early on in the history of molecular biology. And he was a graduate student at the same time at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, France, with François Jacob, who was a close friend of Luria's. And then he happened to go off to Nepal and was so struck by what he felt from the Tibetan meditation teachers that he met there that he gave up molecular biology and has been a monk for 40 years. But now, as you'll see, he's been engaged in a larger enterprise to sort of do science on meditative experience and like look at the neuroscience of what happens in the brain when people have been meditating for very long periods of time and with tremendous motivation and intensity. So it sounds like there's something of a kind of sequence of speakers coming to Google that are in some way all pointing to some hidden dimension of reality that's like in some way hidden to us, in other ways completely self-evident. But when it isn't self-evident, it is really opaque. And I like to think of it as an orthogonal dimension, that is rotated 90 degrees in relationship to conventional reality, but one that allows, in quantum mechanics, for instance, as I understand it, an orthogonal relationship allows actually two different entities to occupy the same space at the same time. And in the mind, that is a very, very useful feature to actually bring online as opposed to kind of leave just as potential. So I'm going to be talking from a number of different angles. I entitled the talk, after talking with Meng about it, Mindfulness, Stress Reduction, and Healing, because that's what a huge amount of our work in the past 28 years at the UMass Medical Center has been about. But there's another parallel element to it, and it partly depends on how you feel about stress and stress reduction. But when we use the word stress reduction, we're not talking about some kind of dime store relaxation attempts to sort of calm people down and just make them feel a little bit better so that they can work a little bit harder. We're talking about actually a transformation in the way in which we relate to our lives, to our bodies, to our calling, to our loves, to our ambition, and so forth, so that we can live lives of balance and fundamental, profound satisfaction. And I believe that's true for human beings, that is possible. And I think that a lot of the time, the society entrains us, if we don't do it ourselves, into severe imbalances that can sometimes be unbelievably addictive, intoxicating, and wonderful on one level, and on the other hand, maybe like actually draining your life's blood on another level or killing you. And so in a certain way, metaphorically speaking, I would say that in this society, we seem to more and more be dying for some authentic door into ourselves in a way that's bigger than just what usually defines us. And that's not to deny the beauty of what we often do, how creative we can be, how important it is to, I mean, at a place like this where you're basically redefining the world and the universe and in ways that potentially are tremendously healing for the planet. But to have this be, in some sense or other, held in a kind of awareness that ordinarily we're just not taught in school, and that requires a certain kind of intimacy and cultivation in order to be able to have it more at our disposal. So, if we're going to start with stress and stress reduction, I mean, periodically, Time Magazine and Newsweek and so forth put stress right up there on front because I don't know. I mean, I started the stress reduction clinic in 1979. And when I think back to 1979, I say to myself, 1979, what stress? I mean, because of you folks and people like you, I can get more work done in a day than I used to be able to get done in a month. And it's far better work. But it still has a cost. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, because then the expectation is not just from other people, but from myself, that I will just like be. So the digital revolution already has sort of catapulted us into a condition where increasingly there's no end to the work day, there's no end to the work week, and so there's a way in which work can encroach all of life. And if you love work more than anything else in the world, hey, no problem with that. And there have always been people like that on the planet. Scientists, musicians, I mean, where it's all that. But there's also potential costs to pay in terms of burnout, in terms of addiction, in terms of overdosing, so that you're not actually tapping into the creativity that maybe you once were. And it requires more and more effort to get the certain kind of return as opposed to less effort and more dance. And so there are actually, but for 20 or 25 years, there have been a lot of research being done epidemiologically. What are the effects of various kinds of risk factors on human health, mentally and physically? Everybody knows smoking is a big thing in this society to actually demonstrate that cigarette smoking is not good for your health. And in 1964, the Surgeon General's report actually came out and said that. So there's that, and there's high blood pressure, and there's high cholesterol, and all sorts of risk factors for coronary disease, for cancer, and so forth. But stress was always considered not measuring up to a bona fide risk factor. But a couple of years ago at UCSF, in the laboratory of Liz Blackburn, Alyssa Epple, who actually happens to be a mindfulness teacher, but is a young assistant professor at UCSF, did a study looking at the rate at which the repeat subunits at the ends of all of our chromosomes, which are called telomeres, and which are required for every cell division in every cell in our body that divides, that it turns out that stress, long-term chronic stress, can accelerate the rate of telomere degradation enormously. And so if you've ever had if you have ever heard the words coming out of your mouth after a particularly horrific experience, God, that one just took years off my life, it turns out it's true. It's because the telomeres once they degrade, the cells can't divide anymore. So if stress increases the rate of telomere degradation, I mean, you can't get more somatic and molecular than that in terms of evidence that stress has potentially, if it's not mitigated, the consequence of basically increasing aging. And I'm not going to go into this study in any great detail. It was published in the PNAS and Proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences in 2004. But just to say that they did this study on parents of children with chronic medical problems that are basically not going to get better. So, I mean, it just doesn't get any more stressful than that kind of thing. It's not like, well, at a certain point I'll get to go on vacation, or this will evolve in some way. No, that's just going to be the way it is for life. But they actually took parents who didn't have chronically ill children, which are the blue points, and what they found was that they were also showing telomere degradation, and what really mattered was how much stress they thought they were under. They were under a lot less stress than the other parents, objectively speaking. But if you think you're under like absolutely intolerable levels of stress, you create that reality. So but that's a very positive finding, because it says if you change your relationship to the stress, in your perception of the stress, then you could actually potentially reduce the rate of telomere degradation. And now every study on meditation has thrown in the telomerase assay and so forth now, and we don't know any results yet, but looking to see whether training in a course of meditation over a period of time might actually slow or restore to normal, say, the rate of telomere degradation. So I just want to throw that out to you, because there's so many exciting things going on in the field nowadays about that kind of thing. But I want to make some pretty fundamental points here. If you stare at that word for too long, it doesn't mean anything, as you know. But I want to make a distinction between how much doing we do and, what's that? Doing, yes. If you're Swedish, it's doing. How much doing we wind up doing over the course of the day, as opposed to what you could call, and the Chinese might call, non-doing, okay? Or what I like to call being. Okay, we're called human beings, but it might be more appropriate, the cliche goes, for us to rename ourselves human doings, because we seem to be very much, doing all the time. And often the doing is coming out of the head, but not necessarily coming out of the heart or coming out of the body. And so it's kind of, in some sense, disembodied doing. And over time, even the greatest doing, disembodied, can get you into real trouble at the level of the body and its health, but also at the level of our human relationships. Have I lost the audience already? Or am I making some sense here? Okay, because a lot of this is going to be impressionistic. In the amount of time I have, I'm not going to be able to go into this in tremendous detail, but what I'm going to be doing is trying to point you at some places where you'll be able to sort of verify this or not for yourself on the basis of your own experience, just by paying attention in a certain kind of way that ordinarily we don't. And if you want a brief definition of meditation, it's about paying attention. It's got nothing to do with Buddhism, mysticism, the East, the West. It's about paying attention. So that, by virtue of the fact that it's about paying attention, it universalizes it. It's about something that's totally universal. And it's not attention for its own sake. It's an attention for the sake of a profound capacity that we all have innately that we ordinarily never pay any attention to, and that is awareness. And I'm going to argue that awareness has a way of balancing out thought in ways that are profoundly intuitive and also profoundly creative. And that we're never taught that in school. We're only taught to think in school, and we get better and better at being critical thinkers, but we're not so good at holding our thoughts and emotions and sensations and relationships in ways that have coherence, groundedness, the potential for greater satisfaction, balance, and if you will, happiness. And Mathieu Ricard's going to talk on happiness, and he'll come in his Tibetan robes, very colorful Tibetan robes, and Mathieu is the real thing. So you're going to really enjoy him, and I urge you not to miss him. So this, We call what we do mind-body medicine. We've been calling it that for a very long time. Finally, the media has picked up on that because we're trying, from the very beginning, we've been trying to actually transform medicine. Medicine itself is suffering from some serious chronic diseases. You may have realized that in your own encounters with the medical profession. And so we're, in some sense, trying to breathe new life into medicine, and in some other ways, through science, and through some other ways, get it back to its Hippocratic roots and not lose the art of medicine while we're developing the science of medicine. I'll just point out, in passing, the words meditation and the words medicine sound a little bit alike in English, don't they? And there's a very, very deep root meaning that they share. And that makes it not quite so weird that we would be bringing meditation into the mainstream of medicine. Whereas, you know, it could have been thought 30 years ago that's tantamount to the Visigoths being at the citadel and about to tear down the gates of the city and so forth. Far from it, meditation has now become completely accepted within mainstream medicine the past 30 years. And I'll show you some evidence of that. I mean, this is basically a photograph of 150 doctors and other health professionals being trained in mindfulness at one of our professional training retreats. I just got back from another one last week. And what we call mindfulness-based stress reduction is spread. This map is 10 years old. And by the way, I'll just like a pitch. This is the perfect environment to do. If any of you folks can put me in touch with software that I can put points on a map at will, I would love that. And just give, without the coordinates, just name the city and it shows up on my map of the world. I'm looking for it. So this is, and I'm serious, I'd love that. So this is a poster of a day-long seminar that was held at the National Institutes of Health at their giant auditorium, the Natcher Conference Center, right on the grounds of the NIH in 2004, called Mindfulness, Meditation, and Health. And what I want to say is, from the perspective of 1979, when I started the stress reduction clinic, the idea that the National Institutes of Health would hold a day-long symposium entitled Mindfulness, Meditation, and Health, it's more improbable, more infinitesimally improbable than that the universe the Big Bang would stop expanding and the universe would begin to collapse. I mean, this is like a huge sea change at the NIH, and they are now funding studies of meditation in the range of between $10 and $100 million at the moment. And are really interested in this, in part because the more you can teach people how to take care of themselves as a complement to what the healthcare system can do, the cheaper it is. And the more effective, because then what you're doing is you're creating a participatory medicine as opposed to an automechanics model of medicine. And we mostly practice automechanics in medicine. And so this is another stream of it that I just want to point out. I'm part of a group of people, Mathieu is as well, called the Mind and Life Institute, which has been around since 1987 and which holds periodic conversations between Western scientists and the Dalai Lama and other Eastern contemplatives on subjects of mutual interest having to do with basically two things: the nature of mind and the nature of reality, and how these different streams and epistemologies and way of knowing might actually inform each other if they have conversations together. And these have all been private meetings. I'll show you some photographs of them in a bit over the years, except that His Holiness then at a certain point said, I want to have more people be able to attend these meetings. So we held a public one at MIT in 2003. You probably read about it in the New York Times Magazine about that time. And that was on neuroscience and meditation. And at that MIT meeting, at least 90% of the questions were about the clinical applications of meditation. So we decided we had to have a second public meeting, science and clinical applications of meditation. And that was held in Washington with twice as many people as the MIT meeting, so about 3,000 people in November of 2005. And I also want you to note, from the point of view of the sea change in medicine, that it's co-sponsored by Johns Hopkins, School of Medicine, which is the oldest and most venerated school of medicine in the country, and Georgetown. So they no longer are in foxholes, not wanting to be associated with either the subject of meditation or with somebody wearing Buddhist robes. The NIH, however, originally we were going to do it on the NIH campus, and they just couldn't handle that because it would look like the National Institutes of Health was promoting Buddhism if the Dalai Lama stepped on there. And so we took it out of the NIH. So now I'm going to give you a brief parenthesis and speak about the Mind and Life Institute, just so you have a sense of this in a kind of parallel universe of what's going on here, especially since Mathieu is coming in. This is Mathieu Ricard, and this is the 17th Karmapa, who is, I think in that picture, 17 or 18 years old. And you know, in Tibetan Buddhism, everybody is the incarnation of everybody else. They've been family for a long time. And and this is one of the Mind and Life meetings where lots of monks come. And here's His Holiness, and His Holiness's translator, Thupten Jinpa, and then Alan Wallace, who was speaking here a month or two ago, and then the Karmapa. And His Holiness, one of the reasons that Karmapa is part of it is that being 17 or 18 years old, His Holiness is hoping that he would get interested in science, because the Dalai Lama is very interested in science. I mean, he's just really into science and engineering, and you can read about his history in that regard, but he's just a natural scientific curiosity. And if you spend days in a room with him talking about science, he's always interrupting the presentations and saying, but have you thought about doing this? And they say, well, Your Holiness, that's the next study that we decided to do. So he's right up there. Even though he's only had like a high school education formally in terms of science, he's like really well-read and also extremely well-tutored by some Nobel laureates and so forth. So he's got this love for science that, and this is, let's see, a bunch of scientists. This is Stephen Chu, who is a Nobel laureate in physics, who's now doing molecular biology. Eric Lander from MIT, from the Broad Center, who may very well win the Nobel Prize for some element of, what's that? Who was? Steve. Oh, Steve Chu was here last week? Well, what do you know? So it's a very tightly woven, inter-embedded family that no doubt Google, I mean, where is Google not? But this is a sort of framework about it that, in these private conversations, and we dialogue. It's real dialogue and inquiry, and very beautiful. And every one of these has a book come out. So you can find them on Google and read them if you have time. And this is a picture of the meeting in Washington where I'm presenting to His Holiness about mindfulness-based stress reduction. And here's Mathieu. Achan Amaro from the Theravadan Buddhist tradition, and Richard Davidson, who's the head of the Keck Laboratory for Neuroimaging at the University of Wisconsin and a collaborator of mine. And to just say, for those young scientists here who are interested in this interface for whatever reasons that I couldn't even imagine, but that maybe you could, because mostly we're talking about neuroscience and behavioral medicine and things like that, but there may be Google people who could, add a whole other element to this thing. We hold periodic, every summer research institutes at the Garrison Institute in New York City. And this is an example, just of us being in conversation with a bunch of young faculty and graduate students and even undergraduates in neuroscience and medicine and clinical psychology on these deeply interesting questions of what we can learn from each other. So that's the end of the parenthesis. The number of, if you track just the number of scientific papers in the literature on meditation, it's beginning to look like it's going exponential. And this is the University of Massachusetts Medical Center where the work that I'm going to describe comes from. So we call what we do mindfulness-based stress reduction. What is mindfulness? I had a friend of mine make some calligraphies for me, and then when I went to China for the first time to talk, I thought, well, hey, I'm going to have all these calligraphies, I better bring them. So this is the calligraphy for mindfulness, and the reason I show it to you is that, as you know, and I'm sure that many of you here speak Chinese, but I don't know any Chinese, so I'm only saying what I've been told. And some people say it's good calligraphy, other people say it's not so good calligraphy. There are a lot of different opinions about this. But as I've been told, this is the word in Chinese, lim, for mindfulness, and it's made up of 2 ideograms, one for presence over the ideogram for heart, okay? And the reason I'm showing it to you is not because of the Chinese, but because if you hear the word mindfulness, it's very easy to think of it cerebrally. And it's like a mind, okay? And so it's like about some kind of cognitive, discursive thought process. But it's not that at all. In Asian languages, I'm told, the word for mind and the word for heart is the same in all these languages. So we need to, when we hear the word mindfulness, also hear heartfulness, so we're not going to understand what it is. And my working definition of it, operationally speaking, is it's moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness that's cultivated by paying attention. Okay? So moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness. Why moment-to-moment? Well, because it's the present moment is the only moment we're ever alive in. It's the only moment we can think. It's the only moment in which we can be creative. It's the only moment in which we can relate, perceive, do anything. And there are 2 interesting things about meditation. They're very often really not well unpacked in our society. One is that just like anything else, it's a learning curve. And so there's a certain way in which meditation is instrumental. Just like driving a car, learning to play a musical instrument. You just do it over and over and over again. You do it. It's you follow the algorithm of the instructions and so forth. And you think that you're going to get better at it, and you're going to have benefits that come from it. And so it's goal seeking, and there's a certain kind of acquisition. And it's always incomplete because it's on the way to someplace else, some better place. So there's an element of striving and an element of thinking. Okay? And it's like with any skill that you learn, that's the instrumental element. But unlike anything else that I know, and the reason that meditation is so powerful is just like in quantum mechanics, when you take an elementary, well, let's say an electron, so I don't have to use the word particle, it's both a particle and a wave. Okay? Or it's neither until you do the experiment, and depending on what kind of apparatus you use, it manifests as particle, it manifests as wave, but we can't really say what it is when we don't do the experiment. So it's kind of just different mode of reality, and they speak of it as being complementary, that the particle and the wave are complementary elements of the non-thing. And the non-instrumental dimension of meditation is that there's no place to go and there's nothing to do. That there's nothing to attain, that this is it. And if you drop into this moment, that it's not about ever it getting any better than this, because it can't get any better than this. This is it. You'll just lose more telomeres in the next minute. If you'll pardon my putting it that way. But it's like we tend to persist that like in the future it's all going to come together better when Google's like much bigger, or when you work out all the kinks or whatever. But that's a very limited way of thinking about this thing, because the future that you're living in now, this present moment, was the future of when Google started. So look how successful you are. Do you know what I'm saying? It's all sort of an element of perspective on it. And if we're always blasting through the present moment to get to some better moment, in a sense, we're not reading the present moment. We're not inhabiting the present moment. And as you'll see, some very famous people have made some very interesting comments about the downside of that. So as it says in the Heart Sutra, the great Mahayana text in all the sort of Buddhist traditions in Asia, nowhere to go, nothing to do, nothing to attain. You're already complete, already whole, completely endowed, and the thinking is not attached to anything. The thought is incredibly powerful, but when it becomes like glomps onto, like we insist that it has to be a certain way, then our thoughts can blind us. And we're talking more about the quality of awareness. So the way I like to put it in the kind of present participle form is awareness sing. So mindfulness is, in a sense, it's awareness sing. We do it all the time, but we're not aware of it. So we need to actually cultivate meta-awareness, meta-cognition, or metacognitive awareness. And I just want to say, I don't want to go into this in any great detail, that this is based on a kind of non-dual view of the universe. That we do create subject and object. We separate things as me, the viewer, and what is viewed, and all of that. And from a conventional point of view, that's fine. But there's some other element that unifies what Wordsworth called discordant elements and makes them work in one society. It's some deeper element of integration that very often we are opaque to. And so that's beyond relative opposites, like what I like and what I don't like. That can rule my life. I only react to things that are pleasant, and unpleasant things I try to escape from all the time. So I'm always trying to get what I want and push away what I don't want. It's a very unbalanced way to live. Getting stuck in positive emotions and negative emotions. I believe that there are no positive and negative emotions. All emotions have information, and if you know how to handle that information, then it can all be really useful. Whereas if you say, well, anger is a negative emotion, sometimes anger is a very appropriate emotion. But if it leads to mindless violence, for instance, then it's not a very good use of your anger. And even you and me, there's a separation there that is not necessarily fundamental. Awareness itself, if you start to become aware of your awareness, it's boundless, there's no center, there's no periphery, it's non-dual, but it is discerning without being completely thought grounded. And it's something you can discern for yourself. So anyway, mindfulness is universal, as I said, but the most articulate expression of mindfulness on the planet comes out of the Buddhist tradition. Okay? And apocryphally speaking, people used to go up to the Buddha and say, "Are you a god?" And he was said to have responded, "No, I'm awake." Okay? And if you know anything about Buddhist iconography, all of these kinds of forms, whether it's the Buddha or various bodhisattvas and so forth, they're not about deities. They're representations of states of mind. They're representations of states of mind, and that's the representation of the state of mind, awake. So the implication is that, we're somehow in a hypnotic dream state that perpetuates itself, and we're kind of awake, but kind of not awake, and in some sense a slave to that unawareness. So we can zone along on autopilot for years at a time, more or less unconscious, even while we're thinking we're conscious. And the implication of that, and you can check this out for yourself, is that you may never be where you actually are, because you're always somewhere else. If you start to see how much of the time your mind is in the future, for instance, how much of the time your mind is in the past, the present moment tends to get a little squeezed. This can have profound implications for creativity, for well-being, for happiness, and for physical and psychological health. Excuse me. So just this calligraphy is the calligraphy for Tao, or path. So we're suggesting in those traditions that there is a kind of lawfulness of the universe, often mysterious, but a way to be in line with that. That's what Qigong and Tai Chi and all those martial arts are about. When you align yourself with certain lawfulness of things, then a certain kind of harmony results from it. And when you don't, then something else. So the notion of a way with a capital W. So part of meditation practice is finding your way with a capital W. It's not like there's one right way. You have to find your own way. You can't just have some arbitrary authority tell you what you need to be doing to be more awake. It's like your job with a capital J, or your way with a capital W. And if you don't know what your way is, great. I mean, we always want our own way, don't we? I love it that when you can see it happening in supermarkets a lot, when the kid has a meltdown and wants like 3 different things at the checkout line, and the parent says, "You can't always have your own way," and the child says, "Why not, Mommy, why not?" And you wind up saying, "You'll understand when you grow up." But isn't it true that when we've grown up, and don't we all want our own way? But if somebody with a shaved head and robes comes in with a far-out-looking, gnarled and carved stick and asks you, "What is your true way?" you might not be able to even open your mouth. And this is the calligraphy for literally turning, but it means breakthrough. So what is a breakthrough? It's that orthogonal turning towards something, especially when you feel aversion for it. Instead of recoiling from it, turn towards it. The whole martial art of Aikido, blending, moving in, turning towards. And if you know Rumi's poetry, The Guest House, for instance, it's all about putting out the welcome mat for all the stuff that arrives at our door, whether we like it or not. This being human is a guest house. Every moment, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some fundamental awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if there are a host of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be cleaning you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, greet them at the door laughing. That's advanced practice, and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. That poem is 900 years old. But what it's suggesting is turn towards rather than recoil away from. And see, open your eyes, take a look. That's what this is really all about. And it's suggesting that when you do that kind of turning, there's the potential for breakthrough insights, breakthrough behaviors, breakthrough rearranging of your cellular organism, because the body is listening to what the mind is doing. And when the mind learns how to self-regulate in particular ways through self-observation, interesting things happen. So Thoreau said famously, if you go back and read Walden, you'll see it's all a rhapsody about the present moment. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I hadn't lived. Martha Graham, all that's important is this one moment in movement. Make the moment vital and worth living. Do not let it slip away, unnoticed and unused. And William James, I'm not even going to go into that in the interest of time, but he's basically saying that a method to voluntarily bring the mind back when it wanders off would be the foundation of the best possible education. But he says it's easier to conceive of that than to find one that would really work. But he didn't know anything. It's evidence that he didn't know anything about Buddhism, because that's exactly what it is the mind goes off, you bring it back. The mind goes off, you bring it back. The mind goes off, you bring it back. The mind goes off, you don't want to bring it back, you bring it back anyway against the resistance. And something starts to grow against the very resistance that's a lot more interesting than a bicep. And it's mindfulness. So MBSR is a complement to medical treatment, not a substitute for it. In the hospitals, it's fully integrated into medical clinics and subspecialties. It does involve a certain degree of discipline and work, although I like to think of it more as play than work. And with our medical patients who suffer from severe chronic medical conditions of all kinds, including anxiety and panic and so forth, it's a fairly intensive time commitment. It's 45 minutes a day, 6 days a week for 8 weeks. And there are 4 formal methods that we teach: a body scan, which is a lying down meditation, sitting meditation, mindful hatha yoga, and mindful walking. And so this is an action shot at a body scan. It just goes on like this. Another view. Sitting meditation. It looks like nothing's happening. I want to tell you, this is the hardest work in the world. To be in the present moment, non-judgmentally, for even a fraction of a second is hard work. And I'm basically challenging you to consider that it might have some enormous benefits. We do it in Spanish as well as in English in our inner city clinic, so it's shown to be cross-cultural. Mindful yoga, I won't say any more about yoga. We're in the Bay Area after all. And I know that there's yoga here and massage here and meditation here, so in a sense I'm probably just wasting my breath talking. The real meditation practice, however, is not these formal practices. It's living your life as if it really mattered. So, in other words, your whole life becomes the meditation practice. That's what this is really about. Living in awareness. Living with a certain degree of self-compassion and kindness. And cultivating what, the Dalai Lama and other people calls wisdom. And the body has its own natural wisdom. The mind also has its own natural wisdom. And sometimes we get out of touch with it. So I'll just give you one example. Like the next time you're in the shower, just as homework from this talk, check and see if you're in the shower. You may be already at Google. Of course, maybe you're always at Google and you shower at Google. But you'll be amazed how much, like when you're in the shower, you're already at work. You might have your whole first meeting of the day in the shower with you. You might be in the middle of an argument, but you're not feeling the water on your skin. So you can begin to just gently, and remember it's non-judgmental, so you don't beat yourself up for non-performance on the meditative side, but you just like let the water be in touch with your skin and know it. That's like that sensorium of feeling. You can know it. And that becomes meditation practice. So this was a slide that I was showing His Holiness in that talk. I was trying to get through about MBSR, so I said, well, if you consider life to be a bicycle, then MBSR is kind of like, or any training in mindfulness would be like training wheels, you know? You just kind of get the feel of it, but then you throw the training wheels away. It's all about, you know, the somatic experiencing of it. And you can't, I don't think even at Google you can develop an algorithm for riding a bike. You read the algorithm and you just ride, never fall. The body has to learn from doing, from the engagement of it. And so, you know, and then once you do know how to ride, you don't need the training wheels. And there are a lot of different things, ways that people approach bike riding, okay? How many of you ride bikes to work? I saw a lot of bikes out there. So there's biking and biking. And there's meditating and meditating too, okay? But it's not about, like, Einstein never needed to be like Lance Armstrong, okay? It wasn't his thing. 7-time winner of the Tour de France. The amount of mental energy that it takes to accomplish something like this, virtually unthinkable. That's why the issue of drugs will come up. But the fact of the matter is that you don't have to be like anybody else. You use your bicycle your way. So I'm going to just, in the last few minutes of this before we have questions, I want to just run by you some clinical studies, okay, so that you have a sense of the kind of work that's being done in this area. And just very briefly to say, with a whole bunch of medical patients going through the stress reduction clinic who were medical patients, they had chronic pain conditions, heart conditions, and so forth, but they also qualified for clinically a mental health diagnosis in either anxiety or panic disorder. Okay, so they had that, a psychiatric diagnosis on top of the medical diagnosis. And you can see that like if this is an anxiety scale, you have a step function down over the 8 weeks of the stress reduction clinic. People come to the hospital once a week, 2.5-hour class. In the 6th week, there's also a day-long silent meditation retreat. And so it's 8 weeks, 2.5 hours, once a week, 45 minutes of practice every day. And you see a step function in anxiety. You also see a step function in depression. And then I won't show you the data, but that goes out not just 3 months, but 3 years. So something people do in 8 weeks can have an effect on their lives 3 years down the road. Now I'm going to just very briefly talk about 2 randomized clinical trials. One, the effect of mindfulness-based stress reduction on emotional processing in the brain and immune function in response to a flu vaccine. And then if there's time, very briefly, the effect of the mind on the healing process that you can actually see in photograph. Because healing is a sort of double-edged word in medicine. You have to be very careful how you use it or people start to roll their eyeballs and think you're weird. But wound healing, nobody thinks that about. And so we tried to find a healing process that would not create that kind of resistance. So this is a study that we published in 2003 and with Dr. Davidson, my collaborator. Can mindfulness training in the form of MBSR be used to modify the central circuitry of emotion? And I just want to say, and maybe Paul Ekman will talk some about this, but you probably know that in the past 8 years, the entire basis of neuroscience has been transformed by the discovery that the dogma that we were taught for a generation, that after about the age of 2, there's no new neurons laid down in the central nervous system, and that it's all loss of neurons. It's like downhill from about the age of 2, and you can kind of hear the neurons going exponentially. That turns out not to be true. It turns out that we're making, not just synthesizing new neurons, which is called neurogenesis, but laying them down in particular regions of the brain, and they're functional up to the day we die. And it's driven more than anything else by experience, and more than any kind of experience, repetitive experience. Okay? When you do the same thing over and over and over again, like ride bikes up mountains, or meditate, or play the violin starting at a very early age, where what you do with the right hand, what you do with the left hand are very different. It turns out you can morph what's going on in your motor cortex and somatosensory cortex by just fingering a lot. Okay? And there's a very famous study of the London taxicab drivers downloading the street map of London into their heads, and you see the anterior hippocampus shrink and the posterior hippocampus get bigger over a period of 2 years. Losing a limb, very often different aspects of the brain are recruited to different parts of the body because the limb is no longer there. So neuroplasticity basically means that the brain is not static, but is continually morphing itself in response to experience. Negative traumatic experience can actually atrophy brain function and actually brain size. And therapy and moving in a positive direction can restore it potentially. And that's an area of very ongoing, very exciting research. So I'm going to talk about a part of the brain called the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, which has a kind of division of labor left and right. There's an asymmetry in the lateralization. So left activation associated shorthand happiness, feelings of well-being, approach behaviors. Right activation, all other things being equal, avoidance behavior and difficult emotions. There are also, of course, many other complex regions of the brain. So this is the left prefrontal cortex associated with positive affect in some studies. So here's the kind of summary slide. Left, happy, right, unhappy. I won't belabor it in the interest of time, except that if you take people and put them into scanners or use a quantitative EEG electrode helmet, which I'll show you shortly, and just get people and you don't do anything with them, you just study whether they're more left or more right activated. People who are more left activated describe themselves with words like interested, excited, strong, enthusiastic, alert, and active. And if they're more right activated, they describe themselves this way. And it was thought that in adulthood, you're pretty much like fixed. It becomes a trait. And a study that I will show you now suggests that what was called a set point is actually malleable, that with training and meditation in 8 weeks in a work setting, it will change. And we did this in a biotech company in Madison, Wisconsin. So this is Mathieu, who is coming next week, who has been a subject in many of these studies, along with a lot of other monks. And the qualification is you have to have at least 10,000 hours of intensive meditation practice, which is the equivalent of, say, the concert master violinist in one of the great symphony orchestras. I mean, lots and lots of practice and training. But mostly these monks are over the 40,000 or 50,000 hour. Okay, so, and if Dr. Davidson comes, he will show you a lot more about this story. And this is just to give you a little background in it. This is 150 undergraduate psychology majors and their profile in terms of left and right. So you see there's some outliers on the left, there's some outliers on the right, but it's basically a Poisson distribution. Nice bell curve. This is Mathieu when he's meditating, cultivating what they call non-referential compassion. Non-referential compassion. No subject, no object. And in case this distance looks fairly close, this is 8 standard deviations from the mean. 8 standard deviations. Neuroscience had never seen anything like this. And we've seen this time and time again. It's reproducible, not just in one person, but in many people, that the brain is capable of like the same kind of thing Lance Armstrong is capable of when you push the envelope in that kind of a way. Okay? In the non-doing kind of way, in the non-striving kind of way, in the non-instrumental kind of way. And then this is more evidence from a study in PNAS with Richie and Mathieu, who's an author on the paper, and Antoine Lutz, just showing undergraduates, Buddhist monks. I won't say any more except to say that it's a global recruitment of the cerebral cortex in the monk meditators and the college students with 2 weeks of instruction, trying hard, but that recruitment is something that takes time to achieve. So in our study, we went to a biotech company, high stress, beautiful work environment, biotech company. The president agreed to let us do the study there, randomize people between they take the 8-week program or they don't. The anxiety is reduced in the people that take the program, not reduced in the waitlist control. They all go into the laboratory. And very briefly, I mean, this is just a way to show left versus right activation. Time 1 is before randomization. Time 3 is at 4-month follow-up. And the meditators are in the red and the control group are in the purple. And there's no significant difference before. By time 2, which is at the end of 8 weeks, but I don't have it on this graph, and time 3, the meditators are shifting more from right activation to left activation. That was not supposed to happen by the dogma, that it was supposed to be a fixed point, but they're in 8 weeks on work, during work hours, learning this stuff, they are shifting in the direction of, the same direction as the Buddhist monks. Okay. Meanwhile, the control group is actually getting worse because we are interpreting that as that by the time they're in the laboratory for the 3rd time, it's very, very aversive. And so they're getting more right activated. And we gave everybody the influenza vaccine at the end of the 8 weeks and then monitored their blood titers for antibody. The meditators mount a stronger immune response than the non-meditators. And then when we plot the degree of shift, brain shift, right to left over the degree antibody titer, we get a linear relationship with a fairly significant correlation in the meditators and no relationship whatsoever in the control group. Okay, so that's just kind of like one little thumbnail sketch of the kind of science that's being done now. And it's coming out of the hospital into the work setting. And people who took the MBSR program reported that they were much more effective in managing their stress. And this regulation of emotion you could think of as like enhancing the effectiveness of our emotional intelligence. And then it has effects on health, at least in terms of the immune system. And we don't know enough about it to say any more than that. And that's why all these other studies are ongoing. I'm just going to say very briefly about the skin disease that you can see in photograph in healing. Bill Moyers was filming in the stress reduction clinic back in the early 90s. And we had done a pilot study that showed that people with psoriasis who were meditating while they were receiving ultraviolet light treatments for their psoriasis healed much faster than the people who were just getting the ultraviolet light treatments. Now, ultraviolet light's not a cure for psoriasis, but psoriasis is an uncontrolled cell proliferation in the epidermis. But it's not cancerous. But it's got kissing cousin genes to cancer. So it's like a really interesting question. Can the mind influence healing? Right down to the level of gene expression, control of cell division, and so forth. For its own sake, and also because of its potential applications for cancer. So when he was filming in the clinic, we had this very exciting pilot result, but we couldn't talk about it because we were in the middle of doing the replication study. So this is what psoriatic skin looks like, and it can cover the entire body, and it's very labile with emotional stress. So the more stressed you are, the more, of your body can be covered. This is what an elbow looks like, and then that's what the same elbow looks like clear. So we randomize people between 2 conditions. They either get the meditation while they're undergoing ultraviolet light, or they just get the ultraviolet light by itself. And this is how you get exposed to ultraviolet light. You go into a light box, like a telephone booth. It's on wheels, so the door closes. And then it's like kind of, you're standing there naked with a pillowcase over your head and goggles on to shield you from your corneas from the UV. And it's not like going to the beach. Yeah. It's more like going into your toaster oven. I'm serious. And so you're really getting grilled. You can only be in for short periods of time, and we titrate people up in time as they accommodate to the intensity of it. And we put speakers on the top, and we did a guided meditation while they were, if you were in the experimental group, while they were doing it. And I'll just jump to the chase and say, this is the probability of clearing graph for the meditators listening to the guided meditation tape. That's the only meditation training they got. No person, just a disembodied voice, no classes, no group support, anything like that. The meditators are obviously healing with the different kinetics from the people who are just getting the UV. And that's whether it's what's called photochemotherapy. I'm glossing over a lot of details, but these are published studies, or just the ultraviolet light by itself, which is a weaker treatment, so everything's translated more to the right. But still, at the midpoint of the probability of clearing, you've got a 35 to 40 day difference. And when you do the statistics, it turns out the meditators are healing at 4 times the rate of the non-meditators. And I won't walk you through the table, but there are implications of this study. One is that the mind can positively influence the healing process and speed it up by a factor of approximately 4. That's pretty interesting, if that's true. We've seen it twice, so we tend to believe it more than we would otherwise. And it's doing it down, it's got to do it down to the level of gene expression. There are all sorts of other implications of this study, which I won't go into right now. And just for the sake of having some time for dialogue, I'm going to stop and just quote William James again, or for the first time, since I didn't the first time. I have no doubt whatever that most people live, whether physically, intellectually, or morally, in a very restricted level of their potential being. They make use of a small portion of their possible consciousness, much like a man who out of his whole bodily organism should get into a habit of using and moving only his little finger. And then very famously, we all have reservoirs of life to draw upon, of which we do not dream. So I just want to say in closing, there are plenty of opportunities to do this kind of training if you're interested. The Bay Area has more MBSR teachers, higher density of MBSR teachers than any place else on the planet. And if you're interested in the work of the Center for Mindfulness, that's this website. And if you're interested in the work of the Mind and Life Institute and the Dalai Lama, that's that website. I want to apologize for blasting through this so quickly, but I wanted to give you a kind of a broad enough range of this so that you understand that there's an art to this, there's a science to it, and the fun really comes in the interface between the two. And then there are very, very real 28 years worth of data on clinical applications of this kind of thing, now more and more grounded in molecular changes at the level of cells and also neuroscience and the level of the brain. So that's a very exciting time in both medicine and science to start unpacking these kinds of things. But even beyond the science of it, there's the kind of excitement of maybe it making accessible to us a dimension of living that's been, if you don't mind my using this in a pun-like way, right under our noses from the very beginning, and that that we easily miss because we blast so much through our moments, and we're so into thinking but not so much into being aware of what we're thinking. So I want to thank you for your attention, and now open it up to any kinds of questions, comments, observations, if you care to.
Questions. Can you tell people that you'll be having meditation at 3:15?
Yes, just Meng is suggesting that I say that at 3:15 there'll be a meditation class for anybody who wants to dive into the actual practice itself rather than talk about the practice. Yeah, so please go
just
ahead.
a basic comment that you showed many pictures of monks and just did the studies on monks.
Yeah.
I just want to say that the monks they may have less stress, but their life seems to be really boring. For people who are working at Google, and we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of things to create. We do have a lot of stress. Just there's sort of some kind of a balance between a monk's life and an engineer's life. For people who have a lot of stress generating work to do, how do you handle this?
Okay, well, I want to make sure that you understand that the reason I'm showing the picture of the monks is basically to show outliers, okay? But the fact is 17,000 people have been through our stress reduction clinic over the past 28 years, and none of them know anything about monks or Buddhism and could care less, and they're all stressed up the kazoo, or wazoo, or whatever you want to say. So this is... My point showing about the monks was that the regular people in the work setting, when we did that study, their brains shifted in 8 weeks in the same direction as the monks who've been doing it for 40 years. So there's a tremendous amount of latitude for dealing with the stress that you're under as a person. And very often what we think is, well, the first thing we want is someone to just make it better, like maybe drugs or whatever. But there is no real solution to the kind of stress that we're living with from the outside. It has to be a kind of from the inside, learning to rebalance. And balance is always losing your balance and then recovering your balance. So swimming in these seas becomes something of an art form, and it's got nothing to do with monks. It only has to do with like regular human beings trying to put one foot in front of the other and live our lives as if it really mattered, and not get so stressed out in a particular direction that we lose sight of some of the beauty in our own lives. On the other hand, not to get so laid back that we stop contributing to the world or to our work or whatever. And that is an art form, and everybody sort of, in a sense, has to do that interior work themselves, I would say, because no one else is going to be able to do it for you, certainly. So that's the challenge. But I think there's a very, very good track record, which maybe I didn't articulate well enough, that this is for real people. It's got nothing to do with Buddhist monks. It's just that since Mathieu is coming next week, you might come and see him, just for fun. See that he ain't that different from us anyway. And believe me, the monks have plenty of stress, and they don't think their lives are boring. I mean, boring is as boring sees it, so, it could be different. Yeah.
You defined mindfulness as non-judgmental awareness moment to moment. Why is the non-judgmental so important that it takes 20% of the definition?
Oh, well, without that, I mean, that's the hardest part of it, is like, because we've got ideas and opinions about everything. So the invitation is to see if you can be with a percept without getting caught in your liking or disliking of the percept. It turns out to be very, very challenging. And non-judging doesn't mean, it's not an invitation to get stupid. It's not like, well, I'm not going to be judgmental anymore. I'll just walk out there and, if a truck's coming, no problem. I'll just walk in front of the truck. It's not about that. We make a very fine distinction between non-judging, which is like, judging is kind of, in my vocabulary, it's like black and white, good and bad, like, dislike. It's kind of very binary. And we tend to jump into those binary plus, minus, good, bad, very rapidly. Discernment is seeing more the shades of gray between 0 and 1. Everything in between black and white, so to speak. So it's very much, as I'm saying, a way of being. It's an art form where it's not that you don't see clearly, it's that you do see clearly because your mind isn't fogging it over with all your preconceived 0-1 decisions from moment to moment about what you like and dislike, which is a little bit like a prison. Yeah.
So I thought the results about the psoriasis were very interesting, but I didn't think the control group was actually a control group, because in the set who were given the meditation, they were given something. Versus if people are told to take time out and problem solve, whether there's that difference. Because it could also be that if people were played this tape in the middle of their treatment, which said, now think about all your problems and think how you're going to solve them, be active and so on, take care of yourself, take care of your health, eat properly.
We call those anti-meditation tapes.
Yeah, anti-meditation. They might also show this increased result because they might also take time out to take care of themselves.
Now, I'm going on long-term memory here because I don't know of any recent studies of that kind. And you're absolutely right in your criticism of the psoriasis study. It was a pilot study where we didn't give the control group something comparable to either fill their mind, even music, but something comparable at least. But I think the anti-meditation, it's not simply that you're thinking. There's a big difference between the meditators and the thinkers, so to speak. But that is a very sort of interesting question, and no doubt it needs an awful lot more investigating than has been done so far.
I was listening to a tape recently that from a book that the Dalai Lama wrote, and in it he said something very funny about neurobiology. He said he was listening to give a lecture about the amygdala, and I think it was Goleman, and how the amygdala has all these negative impacts on our emotions. And he laughingly thought to himself, well, then enlightenment is simple. We'll just cut out the amygdala, and then we'll all be enlightened beings. And of course it doesn't work that way, because when you cut out the amygdala, there's a whole host of responses that you excise from the opportunities that humans can have in their interactions, such as being rightfully afraid or any time you're startled, then you need that. However, I was thinking about the studies and how you were talking about the right and left prefrontal cortex. and how there's a noticed diminished activity in the right prefrontal cortex. And then I thought about what the Dalai Lama was saying. Well, and how do we know what the effects of the right prefrontal cortex could be and how they could possibly contribute to a wholesome life? And do we really want to sort of shut out those capabilities and being present with like fear and being present with sort of those more negative sides? Isn't that casting the exact same sort of binary positive, negative thing that you were talking about before?
Yes, and that's why I'm just showing you what's been done and giving you that frame on it. But the larger non-dual perception is saying we hardly understand anything about the brain. And one of the things I glossed over was that left-right shift had to do with very specific loci on the left and on the right. Right next door are other loci that are doing totally different things. The prefrontal cortex is doing a million things at once, so to speak, most of which we don't understand, but it has to do with executive decision-making, all sorts of things. So it's not a matter of like, well, excise the amygdala or find the exact thing that will like get you, a little bit more on the left side, because that's also dualistic. So we're beginning to unpack some of what are called the neural correlates of meditation, but we're light years away from understanding the brain or what is really involved when you drop liking and disliking, this and that, and into an awareness that can hold it all. I mean, but we're doing those kinds of studies with Mathieu and other people where they can rest for extended periods of time paying attention to one thing or to no thing and extend that out and see what the brain does. And, it's all kind of like an incremental learning curve. But it's nobody that I know went into meditation because they wanted to make pretty pictures on fMRI scanners. I mean, they go into it for totally different reasons, but now because of this interfacing between science and meditation, it's becoming interesting, and the risk is it'll become materialistic. That people will glomp onto the results and they'll lose the heart of the whole thing. And even His Holiness and Mathieu are aware of that. Okay, last question. Where'd the microphone migrate to?
So I think this is sort of a related question, which is, you said a few times that mindfulness and meditation don't inherently have anything to do with Buddhism. As someone who is a Buddhist, there's something sort of uncomfortable about thinking about people coming to meditation, to cure their psoriasis. And I just wonder, do you worry that something might be lost as if meditation does come to be seen as essentially just a medical treatment and not a spiritual practice?
Oh. Yeah, but I don't see it that way at all. I don't think that first of all, the people who are with the psoriasis, they're just agreeing to be part of a study on meditation. They're not coming to meditation the way somebody would come to meditation. And even in the stress reduction clinic, why do people come to the stress reduction clinic? Really one reason and one reason only: suffering. Okay? So, this question got posed to the Dalai Lama around whether this kind of thing is kind of like the death knell of Buddhism, because we're taking what you might call the heart of Buddhist meditation. People do call it the heart. But if it's a decontextualization of it, it would be a desecration or a denaturing of it, and then offering it to people who are suffering. That would be a disaster, and I hope we're not doing that. What we're doing, in my view, is it's a recontextualization. And I asked him during that presentation, when it came time to ask him questions, I said to him, do you see any difference between Buddha Dharma and the universal Dharma? And he said no. And so as long as this mindfulness is grounded in ethics and morality and all of the kinds of things, and it is, all of the kinds of things that would go into a kind of a full spectrum meditation practice, it doesn't need to be Buddhist in order to reduce suffering. And when His Holiness was posed this question about whether this is a good thing for Buddhism or not that this happened, he said the following. He said there are 4 billion people on the planet, 1 billion Buddhists, 3 billion non-Buddhists, all 4 billion are suffering. So what are we going to do? Just keep it for us Buddhists? And he actually is promoting this, what he calls secularized meditation, that's like beyond Buddhisms or any other isms. And MBSR is really just an example of that, 25 years earlier. But it's not at all meant to be, and and you use the word spiritual. So I just want to say that I have a lot of sort of trouble with the word spiritual because it's used in so many different ways. My working definition of the word spiritual is what it means to be really human. We don't know what it means to be really human. So, but I like that because it doesn't get into, oh, she's so spiritual and he's not very spiritual. Because, I mean, what isn't spiritual? You know, it's like chopping vegetables spiritual, making love spiritual. Well, it all depends. How present are you? So I love that I'm even here and that we're having these kinds of dialogues and questions because I think we're in a place of so much not knowing. And the awareness itself has an element of not just knowing, but not knowing. And the bound between not knowing and knowing, that's where the juice lies. And so there's just tremendous creative opportunities. And I think in terms of medicine, and I think in terms of our society, in a certain way, you could say that the human mind has reached a part, if you don't mind my sort of branching out a little bit to a more global view, thinking from the last ice age, for instance, all of human history has happened in the past, say, 13,000 years. Everything. And everything beautiful that has come out of human culture, that is in the Louvre or any place else, or in Google headquarters, has come out of the human mind and the human body in 13,000 years, which is nothing in terms of like the history of the planet. And we've managed to call ourselves Homo sapiens sapiens. What does that mean? In Latin, sapere, present participle of the verb sapere, is to taste or to know. So we're the species that knows and knows that it knows. I don't think so. I think we haven't lived up to that one yet. We are still in our infancy, not even knee socks, you know. I mean, we're just beginning to mature enough to understand the global nature of what we've been able to produce with, say, the internet and Google, and what the implications of this are going to be for a society that's still so tribal, for a species that's still so tribal that, you know, you can be Muslims and kill each other over whether you're Shia or Sunni. Never mind Christian and Muslim or whoever, Azerbaijanis and Armenians or Chechens and Russians. I mean, it's just like, there's a certain way in which that's kind of like, can't hold that much longer. Or all of the horrors that have come out of the past 13,000 years, they also come out of the human mind when it doesn't know itself. So the challenge is, could humanity reach a point where we actually own that Homo sapiens sapiens thing, take it seriously, and then do the work of cultivating intimacy with the full range of our human capacities and of the human mind, and then work out ways to deal with the dark side, okay? The side where, like, we're not going to deny that we can get, you know, incredibly violent if we get angry, if we're thwarted, if we don't get our way, if we feel threatened. It's not just in other people. And so that we have 1,000 different ways to maintain some kind of mental equilibrium in the face of our own insanity. That might actually have political ramifications. Like, you know, maybe we need a more mindful politics, you know, where it's not all about self-interest and getting re-elected. You already got elected, do something. But if the doing isn't coming out of being, it's going to be the wrong doing. So when the doing comes out of being, I think, you know, then I'll just close this off by saying, I sometimes say that the human species is kind of like, in some way, and the autoimmune disease of the planet. You know, that without this kind of awareness, we are the first victim of our own precocity. So we're both the agent of the disease and also the first victim. I don't think we need to stay stuck in that kind of thing. And I think there are all sorts of very, very positive and I think optimistic forces for us to actually not only heal ourselves as individuals, but heal ourselves in a much more global way. And I'm sure that Google thinks about this day and night. And is in some way, because of like the power that Google has, and in some way or other maybe is, you know, at least collaborating in the shaping of the present in ways that will profoundly affect the future on the side of sanity rather than on the side of insanity.
Thank you, John.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So just a reminder, we are going to have meditation in University Theatre, and it's scheduled to start 3 minutes ago.